We're here today on RealAgriculture.com. We're with Jeffrey Simpson. He is the National Affairs columnist with the Globe and Mail. Welcome today, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
Jeffrey, let's talk about what is happening in Canada. Based on we have a minority government. There's a lot of ag groups trying to initiate policy change or lobby their cause. With the kind of situation we have in Ottawa right now, is it very, very difficult to get change enacted?
Well, I would have thought for agricultural groups, at least in Western Canada, it would be a prime time because most of the ridings in Western Canada, if they're not New Democrat, they're all Conservative. So the Conservative government, if you look at it, has a big base of support in Western Canada and rural agricultural Western Canada. So if the agricultural groups are going to get things done and they can't get them done with this kind of government, it's hard to know who they could get it done with, because the Liberals have very little support in rural parts of Western Canada. They're not going to oppose a lot of these measures, I don't think. Of course, there's the odd issue like the wheat board, which the Liberals do have a strong, and the NDP for that matter, have a very strong position on. And so that will continue to be a bone of contention.
How different is our situation in Canada right now when we look at government's willingness to make change? How similar or dissimilar are we to what's happening in the United States right now, where it appears they're just diametrically at different ends of the spectrum?
I think the biggest worry that we have in all sectors, whether it's agriculture or whatever, is the state of the economy in the United States. And the state of the economy in the United States is partly a function of the state of the politics of the United States. I mean, they've got an enormous budgetary deficit, and there isn't a glimmer that I see on the political horizon in the United States of people willing to seriously have a go at that. So they have a huge trade deficit. And trade deficits, if you have them chronically, tend to lead to voices crying for protection because they say somebody else is taking advantage of us. They have a very precarious currency because of these trade imbalances and these fiscal imbalances. So the world is absolutely shifting, economically speaking, towards Asia and particularly towards China. And money is flowing at a staggering rate from the United States to China in order to support the United States budgetary deficit. So if you're sitting in Western Canada in any industry, your principal market's going to continue to be the United States. Geography is what it is. They are still a very wealthy country. But with each passing day, Asia becomes more consequential, and China in particular. And any group, be it agriculture or forestry or pulp and paper or oil or whatever, that doesn't understand that has got their head in the sand.
Do you think as Canadians, whether we're in agriculture or any industry, we're just regular citizens in Canada, do you think we worry about how Americans think about us too much?
I don't think we're sensitive. All small countries are sensitive to what big countries think, but frankly, they don't think about as much. So I never get my knickers in a knot when some U.S. politician says something that's critical of Canada or some editorial. The U.S. is a huge, sprawling, pluralist. Everybody's got an opinion. Everybody's got a voice. So, calm down if somebody takes a run at Canada.
When I heard you speak a couple months ago at a conference, somebody asked from the floor a very interesting question, and actually I wrote a piece on it. It was about, can agriculture speak with one voice? And you had a very interesting comment about it. What was your answer? Can agriculture speak with one voice?
Well, I hope I'm giving the same answer to you. I think it's difficult for agriculture to speak with one voice. It's difficult because agriculture is a word. Let's take my world, the media. You say the media. Okay, the media is in the business of communicating things to people. Agriculture is in the business of producing things for people to consume. But within the media, you're talking about newspapers, television, radio. You're talking about new media like this one. You're talking about webcasts of all kinds. You're talking about podcasts, Twitter, blogs. I mean, so media is a word that does connote one thing. You're communicating information or impressions, just like agriculture does. But within that, there are all these variations. And of course, we have the classic divide in this country between export-oriented agricultural producers, most of whom are in Western Canada, and those that are protected by supply management, principally in central Canada through the supply management for eggs and poultry, etc. which means that when we go, I think I did say this, when we go abroad to participate in international trade negotiations, it doesn't matter which government's in office, this is a nonpartisan statement. We go over on the one side of the room with all the countries that want to reduce protectionism to help out the cattle industry or the wheat producers or the barley producers or others who export. And then our negotiators go off into the other corner with the French and the Japanese and the Koreans who want to obstruct any move towards diminishing trade barriers because they protect their farmers so much, just as we do with supply management. So countries, when they look at Canada in these international trade negotiations, they always see a country that speaks out of two sides of its mouth. And so that's just one of the divisions.
And so is that going to come to roost eventually? Are we going to be called on, like actually be called on it, where it's like, okay, Canada, you gotta kind of pick what you're going to do here?
We're called on it in the sense that if, and this is a capital I, capital F, if there were to be a successful conclusion of another world trade round, we would be forced by, well, we could refuse not to sign the agreement, which would be catastrophic. But if there were an agreement and we signed it, part of the agreement would be to have us reduce the barriers that we put up to the importation of those supply managed products. As you know, at the moment they have tariffs of 200 to 350%. I can't guess by how much they'd have to come down. They'd still be pretty high, but they'd certainly have to come down.
Yeah, well, and you can
bet that doesn't mean that we'd have to get rid of them. I remind people sometimes that there are issues in countries that you simply can't debate, apparently, and this is one. Because prior to the last trade round, the House of Commons voted unanimously, 300 and I forget how many members were there, just to say unanimously. There was no one who said no to instructing our trade negotiators not to give an inch on supply management. Now, you can't get the House of Commons to agree unanimously that today is whatever day of the week it is. But they did on this issue. So you can see the very, very intense domestic political support for that policy.
So how much of that, though, people in the West, or maybe specifically Alberta, the comment right away would be, well, that's all because of Quebec. Is there truth to that? Like it's just
well,
Quebec's
yes
an
and no.
untouchable
Yes
subject?
and no. It started in the 1970s. I saw it start. I wrote about it at the time because of pressure from the province of Quebec and because of the fear of Quebec separatism. So that's how it started. And the ministers who wrote the policy, like Marc Lalonde and André Ouellette, were from Quebec. But it didn't take very long for the dairy producers and the chicken producers and so on in Ontario and Atlantic Canada and British Columbia and elsewhere, but principally in those areas, to figure this is a pretty good deal.
Yeah, no kidding.
So yes, it started in Quebec. Yes, it's got almost universal support in the province of Quebec, but it has now become equally entrenched in Ontario, rural Ontario, and other parts of the country where they produce these products.
Let's finish up by talking about provincial relations. Agriculture has a very diverse industry across the province. When we look at BC, it's different than Alberta and the rest of the West, and Ontario is a whole different animal, and Quebec's even more different. How has provincial relations been just overall? Is it getting better? We kind of pick what we agree on, and we disagree. We choose to disagree.
In agriculture, I don't detect any big complaint. I mean, the complaint is the one we just talked about between supply management, but people who are in agriculture in other parts of Canada than the supply managed ones, they kind of moan and groan about it, but they know not much is going to happen. Ontario, by the way, is the biggest agricultural producer in the country. Most people in the West don't know that, right? And people in Ontario don't know that either. It's a huge industry in the province, industries in the province of Ontario. So we think of Ontario as manufacturing and steel and high technology and films and all that, but it's actually a big agricultural producer. But I haven't detected any substantial interprovincial problems.
So overall, do you think Canadians really understand each other? We are such a big country. Do we understand each other very well?
Look, Canada is one of the oldest countries in the world as presently constructed. It's not old as a civilization, but it's an old country. It's been going for 140 years, and there aren't that many countries that have been going that long under current political arrangements, right? France has been around for centuries, but since the Second World War, it's had 6 constitutions, and then it had kings, and it had emperors, and it had so on. So this is a considerable success, this country. And yes, we always have internal tensions. And yes, we came close to breaking up at least once, and maybe the issue will come back again. And yes, if you drive around, as I did in the last couple of days of rural Alberta, you see people who put signs on the side of trucks that say, "More Alberta, less Ottawa," right? But if you look at the Olympics and you look at the degree of national sentiment now compared with 30 years ago, I think it's a much, much stronger sense of what Canada is and who we are, a much greater sense in the accomplishments of the country. And look, we have economic problems, to be sure, but you wouldn't trade our problems for those of any Western democracy, right? Those other countries would die to have these problems. So we should be mindful when we talk about these problems that we've done a certain number of things well. And my view is that if we make just 2 or 3 difficult but important decisions in the next year or 2, principally to get the deficit eliminated as quickly as possible, we're going to be in absolutely splendid shape relative to everybody else for quite a long period of time.
Glenn Hodgson from the Conference Board of Canada commented this morning that we will be one of the first large industrial nations to have a balanced budget.
Well, we'll be the first. The question is how quickly will we do it? And I am of the view that we should do it with all deliberate speed. Politically, they want to drag it out a bit, and they want to say, yes, we're in better shape than everybody else, so don't worry. But just ask yourself, why did we come through the recession better than everybody else? It was because we'd taken strong medicine some years before. We got our fiscal house in order. We had 10 or 11 consecutive years of surpluses. We ran down the debt. We had a low debt to GDP ratio. We had low interest rates. I mean, it was a very virtuous circle which started by balancing the budget. So that got us through this recession better than everybody else. So I say if something worked in the past, in these very, very uncertain economic times, and they are uncertain, the best policy for Canada, the safest policy for Canada is to get back as quickly as we can to a balanced budget again.
Well, Jeffrey, thank you very much for joining us today, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to you again soon.
Thanks very much.